Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Iconic moments from two of the most iconic and impactful presidents of the 20th century, Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to this special edition of the New York Times Close Up. Our guest, David Rubinstein, the man behind the superb new book, The American Story, Conversations with Master Historians. Those historians include 9 Pulitzer Prize winners, ranging from Doris Kearns Goodwin to Ron Chernow to Robert Caro, John Meacham. The conversations took place at the Congressional Dialogue Series, dinner events where Mr. Rubenstein interviewed the authors and historians in front of a congressional audience. A little background on David Rubinstein. He's the co-founder and co-executive chairman of the Carlyle Group, a hugely successful global investment firm with over $200 billion in assets under management. Also made an enormous mark in philanthropy, patriotic philanthropy, as he calls it. The chairman of the board of trustees of the Kennedy Center, the Smithsonian Institution, the Council on Foreign Relations. He owns copies of the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the 13th Amendment, not stored in his house somewhere, but lent them all for display at public institutions like the National Archives. Also donated millions to repair the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial. He refers to gifts like that as patriotic philanthropy, and his charitable giving extends to institutions as varied as Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and the Panda Program, one of my favorites, at the National Zoo. And most recently this past week, to enhance the visitor experience at the Library of Congress. When you started these congressional dialogues 6 years ago, one of the goals in hosting them before members of Congress was to try and reinstitute some bipartisan rapport. Given the party line votes on impeachment this month, has that been a success?
Well, it's clear that the parties are still divided heavily, but I'm not giving up. When we have these dinners, members get together. I ask them to sit with people from the opposite party in the opposite house, and they do. We had one last night where I interviewed David Blight, who wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning book on Frederick Douglass, and members were acting as if there had been no impeachment fight. They were very friendly with each other. So I don't think it's a bad thing to do, but it hasn't yet produced the era of good feelings in Washington yet, but hope springs eternal.
Why should we care about history? In New York, you get the feeling that our history has been hijacked by places like Washington, like Jamestown, Boston, Philadelphia. We don't care much about our history here. I remember seeing Alan Bennett's play The History Boys, and one of the kids is asked to define history, and he thinks for a minute and replies, well, it's just one damn thing after another. Why should it matter to us? Isn't it just old stuff?
George Santayana, a famous Harvard professor, once said, those people that don't remember history are condemned to relive it. The theory of history is that by learning what happened in the past, you can improve upon what happened in the past and make civilization better. What's humanity all about? What's civilization all about? Presumably improving so that the future generations can build on what we have built ourselves. But if you don't know what happened in the past, you don't know the mistakes of the past, how are you going to build on it? So that's the theory of history. My concern is that people aren't learning very much history. We don't teach civics very much anymore, and history. For example, 3/4 of Americans recently were unable to name the 3 branches of government in a survey by the Annenberg. 1/3 of Americans, 1/3, could not name one branch of government. 10% of American college graduates believe that Judge Judy is a member of the United States Supreme Court. And recently, in another survey, 16% of Americans think that Justice Scalia is the Chief Justice of the United States. They think he's alive and the Chief Justice. So another situation is very interesting. If you want to be a citizen in this country, you're a naturalized citizen. You come here from another country. You have to live here for 5 years. You take a citizenship test. There are 100 potential questions. You have to pass 6 out of 10. 91% of the people who take that pass, 91%. The same test was given by the Woodrow Wilson Fellowship Foundation recently to 41,000 Americans born in this country. And in 49 out of 50 states, a majority of citizens couldn't pass the basic citizenship test. The only state in which a majority could pass was Vermont. So we don't know that much, and I don't think it's a bad thing to know more.
And look at who they have for senator.
Well,
You don't have to get into that. But should we have a
I think Pat Leahy is a great
citizenship test for, thank you, should we have a citizenship test for American citizens?
Well, I don't think we should have that because it has the aroma of a poll tax,
Right.
and I don't want that. But there are some states that are now saying to get your driver's license, you have to pass a citizenship test. So I think studying for that wouldn't be the terrible thing. But the bigger problem we have is that people just don't take the time anymore to want to learn about our history. Now, the Congressional Dialogue Program is something I thought would be a good idea to bring members of Congress together, not just for camaraderie purposes and bipartisanship, but these are the people making the laws. And if the people making the laws don't know our history, it's not good. So they come and they're very attentive. We usually have 200 to 300 members of Congress. They bring their dog-eared copies of the books that they've read by the authors. Robert Caro, when he comes, they bring their copies. They want them autographed just like anybody does. So I think it's a good thing. Now, is it going to save all of humanity? No. Is it going to win the Nobel Peace Prize? No. But I think it's a good thing to do, and it doesn't hurt anything.
One of the members of Congress, or former members, who certainly fancied himself a historian, and I think probably for good reason, Newt Gingrich, I interviewed not that long ago, and he said Donald Trump was the greatest president we've ever had. Without going into whether he is or isn't, how could Newt Gingrich make such a statement as a historian?
Well, I don't want to be a spokesman for Newt Gingrich, so I don't want to comment on what he said or didn't say. I think he was a history professor when he was teaching earlier and as an academic. I would just simply say that presidents of the United States, when they have that job, they actually would like to know generally what their predecessors did. And many presidents of the United States bring historians in and they try to learn about previous presidents. And remember, if you're making these decisions, they're very lonely decisions you have to make. You might want to know what a previous president did in a somewhat similar situation.
One of the quotes in the book that I found most amusing or enlightening, perhaps. Justice Roberts is in a cab when he's in school, going, I think, from Logan Airport back to school, and the cabbie asks what he does, and he says, I'm a history major at Harvard, to which the cabbie replies, I was a history major at Harvard, which is why Justice Roberts went to law school. How do you get kids today to major in history when there are no jobs, there's not much interest in it?
2% of males going to college today are majoring in history. 1% of females going to college today are majoring in history. History majors are going down dramatically. I'd like to remind people, the people that are often running the major companies in the United States were social science majors or humanities majors. They weren't all STEM majors. So I recognize that people majoring in history are afraid they're not going to get a job at Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or Google. But in truth, those places want people who can think. And when you take a humanities major or a social science major, you learn how to think. When I'm hiring people, I don't really care whether they major in engineering or economics. I want somebody that can talk, that can think, that has some life to them. And I think the humanities give that to people. Unfortunately, very often, students are afraid that they won't get a job if they don't major in something like engineering or economics or math.
I find history, which I majored in college, history and government, gives you the broadest perspective on things than you can possibly get.
I agree. I mean, I think I love reading history books. I try to read history books about 100 a year. I try to read one history book a week. I love it. It's easy for me to do, but because I'm learning so much of things I didn't know, I wish I knew when I was younger. Unfortunately, I'm now 70 years old, and I don't have another 70 years to read these books, but I'm reading them as quickly as I can.
What did you learn from the congressional dialogues? You're sitting with these authors. These authors have immersed themselves in the lives of former presidents. What did you learn from them, both about the presidents themselves and about the process of doing biography?
Well, doing a biography is very complicated these days. You typically have to spend 7 to 10 years researching and writing it, and each have a different way of doing it. Some have researchers that help them. Some do all the research themselves. Some like to read, research and write. Some just like to do all the research and then they write. It's a complicated process, but you learn that these people know everything about a person. And as a result, when you ask them about Lyndon Johnson or Abraham Lincoln, it's as if you're talking to Abraham Lincoln or Lyndon Johnson. They know it so well. And so you get a sense of history that you didn't get when you were in grade school. When you were in grade school or college, you learn a little about history, you read a textbook. But when you get to read a biography or talk to a biographer, you really know the inside and the outside of a person. So when Doris Kearns Goodwin talks about Abraham Lincoln, she spent 10 years on him. And therefore, you get a good sense of Abraham Lincoln.
Isn't there a frustration, though, for most of these people that they can't interview the people they're writing about? They are dead or long dead in many cases.
I always ask people, okay, if this person were alive, what would you ask them? And surprisingly, after 10 years of research, sometimes they kind of bobble that question. They're not sure what they would like to ask them. But, they usually have some answer that they come up with. But in the end, like if I had a chance to interview Abraham Lincoln or something, I would say, okay, why did you wait so long for the Emancipation Proclamation? Why did you not free the slaves earlier? Or something like that. But there's a lot of good questions. There's no doubt, though, if you do the research, you know the person so well, it's almost as if you're living with the person.
What would you ask some of the other presidents who people wrote biographies of?
Well, George Washington, why did you want to serve as President of the United States, and why did you serve when you really were interested in something else? Did you think the country would really get off the ground? Why did you chair the Constitutional Convention? FDR, did you know anything about Pearl Harbor in advance? John Kennedy, in your case, did you actually think that the Cuban Missile Crisis might lead to nuclear weapons coming here, and suppose the quarantine hadn't worked? Jimmy Carter, my former boss, I could have talked to him at any time, but why did you go ahead with the Panama Canal treaties, which was so unpopular? And would you, if you could do if you could do the hostage crisis again, would you do something differently than you did?
If you had the opportunity to write a biography about someone, who would it be?
Well, many people I admire that all of them have
It doesn't have to be someone you admire.
Well, Doris Kearns Goodwin always says you have to live with the person, you have to sleep with the person.
Right.
So you probably want to spend time with that person. A person who was in my firm for about 15 years after he left government service, Jim Baker, an extraordinary man, Chief of Staff to Ronald Reagan, Secretary of Treasury under Ronald Reagan, Secretary of State under George Herbert Walker Bush. An incredible person. I think he deserves a great biography.
And doesn't have one, right?
There isn't one yet. Peter Baker is working on it, but he's also got some other responsibilities.
Our Peter Baker,
right.
Yes, great. When you look back at the founders, and many of the biographers you interviewed wrote about the founders, were they great men who rose, what was it about this generation that produced those great men, or were they kind of ordinary men who rose to the occasion?
It's an interesting question. We had, in the time of the Revolution, we had 3 million Americans in this country. 500,000 were slaves, and 1.25 million were white women. So you only had 1.25 million white Christian males. Out of that, you got George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, among others. Now we have 330 million Americans. Where are the Thomas Jeffersons, the Benjamin Franklins? I don't know. Something's happened. Those people were uniquely gifted in some ways. They were building a country. They were well educated. They're generally Renaissance men, the way Hamilton was or the way Franklin was. We don't have those people so much anymore because we have specialization. Today, everybody specializes in something. You don't have many Renaissance men floating around.
Is that the reason? I mean, because people are all off doing something else or making money, or?
Well, it's not the only reason. They had a cause of creating a country. And remember, these were people who were committing treason. They were committing treason against the British, but they were committed to doing this. They wanted to build a country. But remember, as is often said, nobody is a hero to their valet. So when you're up close to these people, you see their warts. George Washington wasn't a perfect man. Abraham Lincoln wasn't perfect. They all had their faults. But because we're not watching them the same way we are watching the current president of the United States, we don't see all the faults all the time.
Did Washington really not want to be buried for 2 days?
That's correct, because he was obsessed, as many people were, with the idea that they'd be buried alive. The doctors were not very good in those days, and that's why they put bells in coffins, and if you were in the coffin and you woke up and you weren't dead, you were supposed to ring the bell. That's where the phrase dead ringer comes from.
Really? Okay, that's fascinating to know. Now, if these founders came back, and of course they were all white men, if they came back today, would they think they had gotten it right?
Well, of course, they wouldn't recognize the world that we have. But if you were in a country of 3 million people and you're breaking away from England, and then you come back today, it's the most powerful economic force in the world, the most powerful military force in the world, most powerful geopolitical force in the world, I think they would be astounded at what happened. I guess they would be quite impressed with what they achieved, and they could tell us, here's what I really meant on the Constitution, here's what I really meant about the Declaration of Independence, but that's not going to happen.
Would they think we were getting it right?
Well, that's different because they had their own fights. Some of them might say yes, some of them might say no. It's hard to know. You know, there's a concept that you go back and look at the original intent of the Constitution, but it's very difficult to know what the founders really meant in all cases. So it's really what you believe, and you put it into what you think somebody would have said at that time, but you don't really know.
It's fascinating when you look back at Maclay, the diaries, when you look back at the letters that were exchanged at the time of the Constitutional Convention in the first Congress, that they really were creating something brand new.
It is amazing how many people wrote so many good letters. There's 1,000 letters between John and Abigail Adams, for example. And you see that Abigail Adams, although she didn't really have more than a second-grade education, could write with great eloquence and great intellect. And if you read these letters of the founding fathers, the founding mothers, you see that these people are very, very smart, and you actually kind of feel like you know them because the letters are so personal in some respects.
My favorite was when she wrote, I forget exactly to whom, when the Capitol was being moved from New York to Philadelphia, and she said, well, it won't be Broadway, even
true.
then.
But her most famous letter was when the Second Continental Congress was being put together and they were figuring out how to build the country. She wrote to John Adams, her husband, don't forget the women.
Right.
And of course, they did forget the women because they didn't really care
For a
about
long
women.
time.
Remember, in those days, women could not own property if they were married. They obviously couldn't be office holders and they couldn't vote.
You talk about those letters. What's going to happen to biographies these days when people don't write letters, they don't write diaries, and email and all those things just go off into the ether?
Well, it's more complicated for sure. Letters are written any much anymore. But with the presidents of the United States now, all their emails and their tweets are being maintained, and ultimately historians will see them. But if you go to President Obama's new library when it's open, you'll see no pieces of paper. Libraries are different now. Everything is digital.
When you look at the biographers, what do they have in common?
They're
They're very different people.
Yes, they have in common a fairly good intellect, I would say, ability to concentrate. You have to focus on somebody for a long time, the ability to do a lot of research. They also have, in many cases, the skill to be a good raconteur. It's one thing to write a great biography, it's another thing to talk about it. And some of them talk about it very well. And they have different writing styles, but they're all good. Robert Caro, who we've talked about, he writes on a Smith Corona, writes a couple pages a day, then he rests. I think in the case of Devin McCullough, he writes a couple paragraphs a day, gives them to his wife to read. She reads them back to him. One time he was writing a sentence and a paragraph, she read it back to him and he said, it's okay. She said, no, there's a sentence in here that doesn't work. And he said, read again. And she read it again. He said, no, it's okay. She said, no, it doesn't really work. He said, I don't care. We're going ahead with it. When the book came out, the review by Gore Vidal was, this is a spectacular book, brilliantly written by David McCullough, except he has one sentence in there that doesn't make any sense. How could he put that one sentence in?
One of the things McCullough said in the interview is that, if you think Congress is contentious today, look back at what it was like the beginning of the 19th century, other times. Do we not have enough perspective on things like that? Are we really so much worse off today than we have been at other times?
Well, I don't think we're worse off. Remember, during the Civil War, we were killing each other. 600,000 men and women killed in combat and through disease at the time of the Civil War. There's a book by a scholar, a woman at Joanne Freeman at Yale, where she talks about the fights between members of Congress on the floor of the Congress. Remember, sometimes members of Congress would go and club other members over the head.
Pain each other, right?
So
so we've advanced somewhat.
We've advanced somewhat. Obviously, we want it to be better than it is, but it's not as bad as it was in many ways.
When you listened to the biographers, as well as, of course, read the books, the thing you said impressed you most, or what you described as the most courageous political act of the century, was LBJ's support of the Civil Rights Act. Why was that?
When John Kennedy died, the Civil Rights Act was going nowhere, and John Kennedy was not that big of an advocate of the civil rights legislation. He waited a couple years before he even sent it up there. He didn't want the March on Washington to occur. He didn't speak at the March on Washington, so he was worried about losing the South. And he had won the South very overwhelmingly in the 1960 election.
Thanks to Johnson as vice president.
That's correct, but he also won other deep South states, not just ones that Johnson had some influence in. But Lyndon Johnson said, what's the point of being president if you don't exercise power? And he was determined from the days that he'd spent as a young teacher of young, poor children, Hispanic and African American, that he should do something for them if he had the power. So he decided to push through the civil rights legislation. And he said at the time, when that legislation was signed, this will be the end of the Democrats in the South, and he was right.
If you were interviewing Donald Trump for a biography, what would you ask him?
Well, it is.
And you pointed out that whoever is writing his biography is probably in elementary school right now.
Some people say you have to wait 40 years after a president's gone before you can really know. I have interviewed Donald Trump before he was president. He told me he was going to run for president. I said, president of what? Because I didn't think he'd run for president of the United States. What I would ask him if I interviewed him again, and I would like to interview him again, he said he would let me interview him at some point, are these questions. One, why when you disagree with somebody, do you not just say, I disagree, as opposed to attack the person? Why do you not say, I'm sorry, when you think you've made a mistake? Or
How many politicians say that?
some, not all, but some people do. And why do you feel that you have to attack an individual as opposed to just saying you disagree with them? I don't know why he feels that way, but he does. I mean, he clearly has a style that works. And I would say he has rewritten the presidency. We might not like some of the things he stands for, some of the things he does, and I would say in New York City he may not be that popular in some respects, but tweeting has revolutionized presidential communication. It used to be you had to guess what a president wanted to think or says. Now we know exactly what he wants, and I suspect future presidents will communicate that way. He's also shown that if you've got a core of support, you can use that to get a lot of things done. So he's changed the presidency in many ways.
He certainly has. Quick last question. Do kids still grow up wanting to be president?
I think children do grow up to want to be president, but I think some of them want to be president of Google, president of Amazon, president of Microsoft, or maybe even better, president of a private equity firm.
The American Story, the book by David Rubinstein. Thank you for joining us, and I'll add my thoughts on CODA coming up next. Mike Bloomberg hasn't won a single Democratic convention delegate. Some 4,000 write-in ballots were cast in this week's New Hampshire primary. Bloomberg didn't collect even one vote. He hasn't raised $1 for his belated presidential race. So far, though, credit the former mayor with delivering the best one-liner of the campaign. Asked to assess the state of American politics if the presidential election comes down to a face-off between two New York billionaires, Bloomberg deadpanned, "Who's the other one?" In 10 days after Super Tuesday, we'll know whether Bloomberg is poised to come closer than any predecessor to breaking the political curse on America's mayors. No former mayor has been elected president in nearly a century, since Calvin Coolidge of Northampton, Massachusetts in 1924. No mayor has ever become president without serving first in some other elective office beyond City Hall. No former mayor of New York has won federal elective office since Fernando Wood was elected to Congress in 1862. New Yorkers have historically been burdened by extra baggage. What cost Governor Al Smith the presidency in 1928, Walter Lippmann wrote, was America's antipathy to Smith's, quote, distinctly urban values as much as to his Catholicism. When John V. Lindsay briefly sought the presidency in 1972, the mayoral historian Chris McNichol wrote that Lindsay was seen as the representative of urban America, but he was not seen as America's mayor. Rudy Giuliani earned that title after 9/11. But it had been squandered by the time he ran for president in 2008. Fully 60 years ago, Wallace Sayre and Herbert Kaufman concluded presciently that the presidency could elevate the most mediocre of men. But, they wrote, New York's mayoralty is, quote, the highly vulnerable symbol of all the defects in the city and its government. Even, as it turned out in Giuliani's case, for a mayor who claimed to have finally fixed those defects. This year, Democratic primary voters have to reconcile who they want with who can win in November. If the answer is a progressive Democrat who could draw independent voters and centrist Republicans, Bloomberg fits the bill. After all, he's been all three himself. This year, embracing a moderate from outside the Beltway may prove to be a radical choice, like choosing a chief executive who's been an executive. Bloomberg has yet to be tested beyond savvy campaign strategies built on sophisticated statistics. He still has to overcome the defects of his own mayoral administration, like excessive stops and frisks, and subverting democracy the way he won a third term. He's also been accused of buying the election. But 4 years ago, the presidential candidates collectively spent close to $3 billion, money raised largely from donors who wanted something in return. Bloomberg is beholden to no one. The Citizens United court decision a decade ago let corporations, big contributors, and special interest groups give whatever they want. Why shouldn't a real billionaire be able to spend the money that he earned himself? For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I am Sam Roberts.